Northern Minnesota, November 1897. While his neighbors were nailing up clapboard siding and stuffing newspaper between wall studs, 15-year-old Anders Bjørnstad was chiseling into bedrock behind his shack, carving an addition that looked more like a cave entrance than a proper room. The structure confused everyone who saw it. The opening measured 8 feet wide and 7 feet high, carved directly into the granite hillside that rose behind his inherited cabin. Inside, the space extended 22 feet deep, 12 feet wide, and 8 feet high at the center of an arched ceiling. The walls showed chisel marks in systematic patterns, and the floor sloped gently toward the front, where a knee-high stone wall created a threshold. A cast-iron stove sat just inside the entrance, its chimney running up through a carefully carved channel in the rock. The whole thing looked primitive, like something a prospector might dig while searching for ore, except Anders wasn't mining anything. "Building yourself a tomb, are you?" Lars Gustafsson said at the general store, loud enough for everyone to hear. Gustafsson owned the lumber mill and half the profitable timber lots in Kuchiching County. "That hole in the ground won't keep you any warmer than a wooden box in the cemetery." But Anders had no intention of abandoning his project. He had spent 3 years learning from his morfar, his mother's father, before the old man died, and Olav Andersson had taught him that fighting the Minnesota winter with thin walls and constant fire was like trying to bail out a leaking boat instead of fixing the hole. Before we continue with Anders' remarkable story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story of a teenage orphan who carved warmth from stone when everyone said it was impossible, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories, like this one. Now, let's get back to Anders' story. The happiest memories Anders carried were from those summer evenings in his morfar's workshop, the old man's hands guiding his own across wood and stone, teaching him to read what the materials wanted to become. Olav had come from northern Norway, from Finnmark, where winter lasted 8 months and the sun disappeared for weeks at a time. He'd built his own home half underground, carved into a hillside, and told stories about the Gom, the traditional Sami earth houses that had sheltered people in the Arctic for thousands of years, while wooden structures rotted and burned. "Wood is good for many things," Olav would say, his accent still thick after 40 years in America. "But for winter, wood is a promise you must keep every day. The fire must eat. Always eating. Stone and earth, they remember. They hold what you give them." Anders' parents died in March 1894, when diphtheria swept through the logging camps. His father went first, then his mother 4 days later. Anders was 12. They buried them when the ground thawed in May. His uncle Eric, his father's brother, took him in with obvious reluctance. Eric had 5 children of his own, and a wife who made clear that Anders was a mouth they couldn't afford. They gave him a corner of the barn loft and expected him to work like a man for the privilege of eating scraps after the family finished. That first winter, Anders watched Eric's family huddle around their wood stove, burning through cords of timber that Eric cut from dawn to dusk. The cold still found them. Ice formed on the inside of the windows, thick enough to carve your name in. The children coughed constantly. Eric's wife wrapped heated stones in cloth and rotated them between the children's beds, but the stones cooled within an hour. By morning, water in the bucket froze solid. Eric burned 6 cords of wood that winter, and still they nearly froze. The work of cutting, splitting, hauling, and feeding that much wood consumed every spare moment, and still the cold won. Anders spent that winter mostly in the barn with the animals, where body heat and hay provided more warmth than the house. He watched and learned. The livestock section, dug slightly into the ground and surrounded by earth berms, stayed noticeably warmer than the hayloft above. The difference was 15 degrees some nights. His morfar had been gone a year by then, but Anders could still hear his voice. The earth is 45, 50 degrees down below the frost. It does not change. If you can touch that warmth, you borrow it. If you hide from it above ground, you are alone with the wind. In October 1896, 2 weeks after Anders turned 14, Eric called him in from the barn. "You're old enough to make your own way now. Your morfar left you that worthless piece of land up on the ridge. Time you went and made something of yourself instead of eating my food." Eric's wife didn't even look up from her sewing. Anders packed his things that afternoon. He owned his Morfar's tools, a good axe, a bow saw, 2 chisels, a hammer, a square, and a level. His clothing fit in a canvas bag. His Morfar had left him $16 in a coffee tin, which Eric hadn't known about, and the 40-acre parcel 3 miles north that everyone knew was worthless because it was all rock and pine with no good timber and no farmable soil. He walked there in the rain, arrived at the tumble-down shack his Morfar had used as a hunting camp, and stood looking at the granite hillside that rose behind it like a wall. What Anders saw that others had missed was this. The hillside faced south. The pine forest broke the north wind. A spring ran year-round 50 yards to the east, and that granite was exactly what his Morfar would have called a gift. If you want to find out how a carved stone room would shelter 16 people during the worst winter in Minnesota history, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Anders Bjørnstad built would change how an entire generation of settlers in Kuchichen County thought about surviving winter. Anders spent the first 3 weeks just watching and planning. He noted where the sun tracked across the sky, lower each day as October faded. He marked where shadows fell at noon, at 3, at sunset. He watched the spring to see if the flow changed with weather. He studied the granite face, looking for fracture lines and weakness, places where the stone might crack clean instead of shattering. The rock face rose 30 feet, angled back slightly, it's covered in moss and lichen. Most people saw an obstacle. Anders saw thermal mass and permanent shelter. The conventional approach to building in northern Minnesota was simple. Cut logs, notch corners, stack walls, split shingles, pack the gaps with moss or mud, and burn wood all winter to stay alive. The problems with this approach were equally simple. Wood conducted cold. Gaps leaked heat. The structure sat exposed to wind. And the amount of fuel required was staggering. 6 to 8 cords for a small cabin, 12 to 15 for a family home. A man could spend half his waking hours just feeding the fire and still watch his children's breath fog inside. Anders's approach came from his Morfar stories of Finnmark and the Sami people who had survived Arctic winters for millennia. Instead of building up and fighting the cold, he would dig in and borrow the earth's warmth. The granite hillside provided what his Morfar had called the 3 gifts: thermal mass to store heat, protection from wind, and connection to the stable temperature of deep earth. He started on November 1st, 1896. The first task was establishing the opening dimensions and angle. He marked an 8-foot width and 7-foot height, both sized to match his available materials and provide enough clearance for moving inside comfortably. The opening faced south-southeast to catch maximum winter sun. Using his Morfar's chisels and hammer, Anders began the slow work of carving into granite. He didn't attack the stone. He conversed with it. Granite has grain and fracture lines, if you learn to see them. He would chisel a line 6 inches deep along a natural weakness, then drive wedges into the line and tap them systematically until a section broke free cleanly. Each piece that came loose, he saved. The smaller fragments became floor material. The larger pieces would become the threshold wall. The work was brutally slow. A good day meant removing 2 wheelbarrows of stone. The dust coated everything. His hands blistered, healed, calloused over. By mid-November, he'd carved 4 feet deep into the hillside. Word spread through the scattered community the way it always did. Someone saw smoke from his fire, stopped to investigate, and carried the story back to town. Lars Gustafsson arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, bringing 2 of his mill workers with him. They stood in front of the carved opening, then Gustafsson walked inside, looked around, and laughed. "You're digging yourself a grave and calling it a house," Gustafsson said. "That's the saddest damn thing I've seen." Anders set down his chisel and wiped rock dust from his face. "It'll stay warmer than a wood house." "With what heat? You planning to burn the rocks?" One of the mill workers snickered. "The earth stays about 45 degrees once you get past the frost line," Anders said. "These walls will hold whatever heat I give them, and give it back slow. I won't need much fire." "That's the dumbest thing I've heard," Gustafsson said. "Heat rises, boy. It doesn't come out of rocks. You're going to freeze to death in that hole, and in the spring, we'll find you stiff as a board." He turned to his workers. "Let's go." "Can't fix stupid." They left laughing. Anders picked up his chisel and went back to work. By December, the room extended 12 feet deep. The work went faster now that he had established the dimensions and learned the stone's patterns. He carved the ceiling in a gentle arch, which his Morfar had taught him was stronger than a flat ceiling and would distribute weight naturally. The arch also created better air circulation. Warm air would rise to the center and radiate back down from the curved stone surface. Winter arrived hard that year. The first serious cold came December 18th, dropping to -12 overnight. Anders had moved his bedroll into the partially carved room by then, with the stove positioned just inside the entrance. He burned a modest fire for 3 hours that evening, letting the heat soak into the stone walls around him. By morning, the outside temperature was -15. Inside his carved room, it was 41 degrees. The stone walls radiated warmth he could feel when he placed his palms against them. He'd burned maybe a tenth of the wood his uncle would have needed for the night. He kept carving, 18 feet deep, 20 feet, 22 feet, where he decided to stop because the room felt right at that depth. The total interior space was now roughly 2,000 cubic feet of carved granite. On December 30th, a different visitor came. Thomas Ahlberg was a homesteader from 2 miles west, a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. He'd heard the stories about the crazy kid digging into a hill. Anders was working on the threshold wall when Ahlberg appeared. Unlike Gustafsson, Ahlberg didn't announce himself with mockery. He stood watching for several minutes before speaking. "Can I ask what you're building?" Ahlberg said. Anders set down a stone he was fitting. "A room that stays warm without burning much wood." "How's it work?" "The stone holds heat. It's surrounded by earth that stays above freezing even in winter. The rock keeps that warmth and anything I add with the stove. It gives it back slow, over hours." Ahlberg stepped to the entrance and looked in. The interior was neat, organized. Tools hung on pegs driven into natural cracks. Anders's bedroll lay on a raised stone platform at the back. The stove sat just inside, well positioned for venting. "What temperature you keeping in there?" "It's been between 38 and 44 this past week. I only fire the stove a few hours an evening." Ahlberg was quiet for a moment. "That's actually clever," he said. "Like a root cellar, but for people. My Morfar built something like this in Norway. He said people have been doing it for thousands of years in the cold places." "Your grandfather was Olav Andersson?" "Yes. He helped me set my foundation. Good man. Knew things." Ahlberg nodded. "I hope this works for you." After Ahlberg left, Anders felt something he hadn't felt in years, like maybe someone saw him as something other than a burden or a fool. January 1897 brought deep cold. The temperature dropped to -22 on January 9th. Anders burned his stove for 4 hours that night and woke to an interior temperature of 43 degrees. His water bucket hadn't frozen, his breath barely fogged. He spent January finishing details. The threshold wall, now complete, stood knee-high and served multiple purposes. It held back snow and rain. It created a thermal barrier. Cold air sank and pooled outside while warmer air stayed trapped inside. And it gave him a place to sit while working near the entrance. He carved shallow channels into the ceiling that guided condensation toward the back wall where it dripped into a collection channel and drained outside. He smoothed the floor, filling gaps with smaller stone fragments and sand. He built a reflector behind his stove from salvaged tin, directing more heat toward the stone walls. By February, his carved room was complete and functioning exactly as his Morfar had described. The space maintained an ambient temperature between 38 and 48 degrees, depending on outside conditions and stove use. Anders used approximately 1/3 of a cord of wood that month. His uncle would have burned 3 cords. In town, when he came for supplies, people still smirked when they saw him. "How's the cave treating you?" someone would ask. "Warm enough," Anders would reply. He worked odd jobs when he could, clearing land, splitting wood for others, repairing tools. He had a reputation for reliability and fair prices. The money went for essentials only: food, lamp oil, winter clothes. He saved everything else. One night in late February, struggling with how to improve the stove's efficiency, Anders remembered his Morfar's words about the masonry heaters used in Finland and Russia. Huge stone stoves that burned a hot fire once or twice a day, storing heat in their mass and radiating it for 12 to 24 hours. He couldn't build a full masonry heater, but he could apply the principle. Over the next week, he built a stone enclosure around 3 sides of his cast iron stove, using granite pieces and clay mortar. The stone absorbed heat from the stove and radiated it long after the fire died. The modification added hours to each firing's effectiveness. March brought the first hints of spring, but also the worst storm of the year. On March 14th, a blizzard struck with temperatures dropping to -31 and winds that tore shingles from roofs across the county. The storm lasted 3 days. Anders burned his stove 6 hours the first night, 4 hours the second, and 3 hours the third. The interior temperature never dropped below 39 degrees. He stayed comfortable, dry, and safe while the storm raged. When the storm cleared, Thomas Ahlberg came by again, this time bringing his wife and 2 children. They'd spent the storm burning furniture and fence posts when their woodpile ran out, huddled in one room, and still nearly froze. "Is it true?" Ahlberg asked. "Did you stay warm in there during the storm?" "Come see for yourself," Anders said. They stepped inside. The space was immediately noticeably warmer. Ahlberg's daughter, maybe 6 years old, said, "Papa, it's not cold." Anders showed them the thermometer he'd bought with his savings. 44 degrees inside. Outside it was still -8. "How much wood did you burn?" Ahlberg asked. "Maybe 40 pounds total across 3 days. Ahlberg's wife touched the stone wall and held her hand there. "It's warm. The wall is actually warm." "That's the thermal mass," Anders said. "Stone holds heat for hours. When I fire the stove, the heat soaks into all these walls, 2,000 cubic feet of granite. Then it comes back slow. The earth around it stays above freezing even in winter, so the rock never gets truly cold. I'm just keeping it comfortable." "Why didn't anyone think of this before?" Ahlberg said. "People did, just not here. My Morfar's people knew it. The Sami people in the Arctic have built earth houses for thousands of years. They work with the cold instead of fighting it." The Ahlbergs stayed for an hour, asking questions. When they left, Ahlberg said, "You might be the smartest person in this county." Anders didn't feel smart. He felt like someone who'd listened to his Morfar and had nothing to lose by trying something everyone else thought was crazy. Spring came. The snow melted. Anders planted a garden in the small clearing and worked on improving his shack, which still served as his workshop and summer kitchen. The carved room stayed a constant 50 degrees through spring and summer, cool enough that he used it for food storage. Summer faded to fall. October arrived, and with it, preparations for winter. Anders cut and stacked 2 cords of wood, twice what he'd need, because he'd learned to plan for the unexpected. November brought the first cold nights. December brought serious winter. And January 1898 brought something nobody had seen before. The cold arrived January 11th and didn't leave for 9 days. The temperature dropped to -35 on January 13th, then -37 on the 14th. On January 15th, Thomas Ahlberg's thermometer read -38 degrees at dawn, and it barely climbed to -32 by noon. Across Cauchy County, people burned everything they could. Furniture, tools, fence posts, anything wooden went into stoves that couldn't keep up with the cold. Children and elderly died in their beds. Livestock froze in their barns. The town doctor, making rounds to check on families, lost 3 toes to frostbite. Lars Gustafsson's family burned through their entire winter woodpile in 4 days and started burning green wood that barely produced heat. Gustafsson's youngest son developed pneumonia from sleeping in a room that never got above freezing. His wife's hands developed chilblains that wouldn't heal for months. On January 17th, Thomas Ahlberg made a decision. His family had been burning every scrap of wood they could find, sleeping in one bed together for warmth, and still they were losing the fight. His wife's lips were blue. His daughter wouldn't stop shivering. He bundled his family in every layer they owned and told them they were going to Anders's place. It was a mile and a half through brutal cold. The journey nearly killed them. The cold bit through their clothes like knives. Ahlberg's son fell twice, too cold to coordinate his legs. Ahlberg carried him the last quarter mile, each breath burning his lungs. He expected to find Anders frozen. The cave experiment failed, but he had nowhere else to go. When they finally stumbled up to the hillside, Ahlberg saw smoke rising from the chimney pipe. The carved entrance showed lamplight inside. Someone was alive. He pounded on the wooden door Anders had built to cover the entrance in the worst weather. Anders opened it wearing a simple wool shirt and work pants, no coat. Warm air rolled out of the opening. "Thomas, get in here." Anders pulled the family inside and shut the door. The Ahlbergs stood in the entrance, and all of them stopped moving as the warmth hit them. It was overwhelming after so many days of fighting cold. The walls radiated heat. The air felt soft. The floor wasn't frozen. Ahlberg's wife started crying. "What's the temperature?" Ahlberg asked, his voice rough from cold. Anders checked his thermometer. 47 degrees. I fired the stove about 2 hours ago. "What's it outside?" "Haven't checked this morning, but it was minus 36 last night." Ahlberg did the math in his head. 83 degrees difference. "How much wood are you burning?" "Maybe 30 pounds a day in cold like this." Ahlberg had burned 200 pounds yesterday and still couldn't keep his house above 20 degrees. Anders fed them hot soup from a pot on the stove. The children stopped shivering. Color returned to faces. Ahlberg's wife held her hands against the stone wall and kept them there, letting warmth soak into her chilblained fingers. "Can we stay?" Ahlberg asked. "Just until the cold breaks?" "Of course," Anders said. "There's room." The Ahlbergs stayed 4 days. They slept on the floor, warm for the first time in a week. Anders shared his food without complaint. The carved room maintained its steady temperature, while outside the cold killed 3 more people in the county. When the temperature finally climbed to minus 10 on January 21st, Ahlberg took his family home. Before leaving, he said, "I'm telling everyone. They need to know this works." Anders shrugged. "They called me crazy last year." They were wrong. Word spread fast after that, the way news of survival always does in desperate times. Within a week, a steady stream of visitors came to see the carved room. Some came skeptical, others desperate. Anders showed them all the same things. The thermometer readings, the stone walls, the modest fire, the simple physics of thermal mass and earth shelter. Lars Gustafsson arrived on January 28th. He looked older than he had a year ago, worn down by the winter and his son's illness. He stood in the entrance of the carved room and didn't say anything for a long time. "How?" he finally asked. Anders explained it again. The Earth's stable temperature. The stone's thermal mass, the south-facing entrance for solar gain, the minimal heating needed to maintain comfort once the mass reached temperature. "I called you stupid," Gustafsson said. "Yes, I was wrong." It clearly cost him something to say it. "Would you teach me? I want to build one of these." "It's just stone and time," Anders said. "I can show you." Over the next year, Anders helped 6 families carve earth-sheltered rooms into hillsides around the county. He taught them his Morfar's principles. Work with the earth and not against it. Seek thermal mass, not more fuel. Observe before acting. Use what the land gives you. The first family to complete their own carved room was the Ahlbergs. Thomas worked evenings and Sundays for 8 months, carving into a hillside on his property. Anders visited every few weeks to advise. When the room was finished, the Ahlbergs moved their beds into it that November. They burned 1 cord of wood that winter, where they'd previously burned 10. By 1900, 19 earth-sheltered rooms had been built in Cochiching County. The techniques varied. Some people built with stone and earth instead of carving solid rock. Some incorporated more wood framing. But the core principles remained constant. Every structure dramatically reduced fuel needs and provided reliable warmth. The University of Minnesota sent a researcher in 1901 to document what was being called the Anderson method after Anders's Morfar. The researcher measured temperatures, calculated heating efficiency, and wrote a paper about indigenous building techniques and thermal mass. The paper credited both Olaf and Anders Bjørnstad. Anders built 4 more earth-sheltered structures over the next decade, each one teaching him something new. He never charged for advice and never sought recognition. He worked his land, helped his neighbors, and lived simply. In 1903, at age 21, he married Emma Lindstrom, whose family had moved north from Minneapolis. She'd heard about him before they met, knew the story of the carved room in the cold winter. Their first conversation, she later told People, was her asking to see it, and him quietly showing her how stone could hold warmth like a memory. They raised 3 children in an expanded home, that incorporated the original carved room. The stone chamber became their living space in winter, their root cellar in summer. Anders taught his children what his Morfar had taught him. Read the land, work with natural forces. Build slowly and build to last. Their old dog, a mutt named Bjorn, who'd shown up starving one spring and never left, died in 1919 at an impressive age for a working dog. They buried him on the hillside above the carved room under a simple stone marker. The children cried. Anders dug the hole himself and said, "You were good company, old man." Anders died in February 1944 at age 62 of a heart attack while splitting wood. By then, the principles he'd learned from his Morfar and proved in stone had influenced building practices across northern Minnesota and into Canada. The earth-sheltered homes and root cellars he'd helped design had sheltered hundreds of people through 50 winters. His funeral drew 73 people on a bitter cold day. They came from across 3 counties, including people who'd been children when their parents built earth-sheltered rooms with Anders's help, and people who'd only heard the stories but wanted to pay respects to someone who'd proved that old knowledge still worked. His grandson Eric, named for the uncle who'd thrown Anders out, gave the eulogy. Eric had become an architect and incorporated earth-sheltering principles into his practice. "My grandfather was called crazy for carving a room in stone," Eric said. "People laughed at him, told him he'd freeze, that he was digging his own grave, but he had the courage to trust what his Morfar taught him, even when everyone said it was foolish. He built slowly, he observed, he let the land teach him, and when the coldest winter in memory came, he was warm while others froze. Not because he was lucky, because he understood something others had forgotten. He lived 62 years in that carved room, raised a family there, and taught anyone who asked. He never sought fame or profit. He just built things that worked and helped people stay alive. Rest now, Morfar is waiting, and the stone will hold." Today, the original carved room still stands, now part of a small heritage site maintained by the County Historical Society. Modern insulation and lighting have been added, but the core structure remains unchanged. 22 feet of carved granite, facing south, connected to the earth, still maintaining a stable temperature year-round. Visitors come throughout the year to see it. They touch the stone walls, read the information plaques, and try to imagine the 15-year-old orphan who saw possibility where others saw only worthless rock. 3 memorial markers stand on the hillside above the carved entrance. The first, weathered granite with carved letters, reads, Olav Andersson, 1829-1893. He taught that warmth comes from wisdom, not just wood. The second, similar stone, Anders Bjornstad, 1882-1944. He proved the old ways still work. The third, smaller and worn, Bjorn, faithful companion. The cold of January 1898 tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged for generations, that the way things had always been done in Minnesota, wooden houses and constant fires, was the way they should continue. Anders proved that wrong, not with theory or argument, but with a thermometer and the simple fact of his survival. While others burned everything they owned and still froze, he stayed comfortable with a modest fire and stone walls. The principles he used were ancient, developed by Arctic peoples over thousands of years. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia built gami, earth houses that sheltered families through winters where the sun disappeared for months. The Inuit of Canada and Alaska built karmat, semi-subterranean houses that used Earth's insulation and thermal mass. Indigenous peoples across the northern latitudes understood what modern builders had forgotten. The Earth is an ally against cold, not an obstacle to overcome. Modern building science has confirmed what Olav Andersson knew intuitively and what Anders proved in practice. Earth maintains a stable temperature below the frost line, typically between 40 and 55 degrees depending on latitude. This geothermal stability provides a massive thermal battery. Materials with high thermal mass, stone, earth, concrete, absorb heat energy and release it slowly over hours or days. A properly designed earth-sheltered structure can reduce heating needs by 70 to 90% compared to conventional construction. Anders succeeded because he was willing to question conventional wisdom when everyone else accepted it without thought. He had nothing. No money, no family support, no formal education. But he had observation, patience, and willingness to learn from traditional knowledge that modern society had dismissed as primitive. What Lars Gustafsson and others built quickly and cheaply with conventional methods fell apart within decades, requiring constant maintenance and consuming vast amounts of fuel. What a 15-year-old orphan carved slowly and carefully into granite still stands after more than a century. Still functioning exactly as designed, still teaching people about thermal mass and earth sheltering. There's a metaphor here about extraction versus stewardship, about knowledge that's hoarded versus knowledge that's shared freely. Anders never patented his methods or charged consulting fees. He taught anyone who asked because he believed warmth and survival weren't commodities to be sold. They were basic human needs that traditional wisdom had already solved. The 19 earth-sheltered structures he built or advised on directly sheltered hundreds of people through the brutal winters of the early 20th century, providing comfort and safety when conventional systems failed during the coldest nights. Most of those original structures are gone now, replaced by modern homes. But the knowledge survives in building codes, in architecture programs, and in the growing movement towards sustainable, earth-sheltered construction. So, here's the question for you. What abandoned wisdom exists in your own heritage? What dismissed knowledge has modern convenience written off as primitive or outdated? What might happen if you looked at it the way Anders looked at that granite hillside, not as a dead end, but as a beginning? Not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity? If this story resonated, if it made you think differently about survival, innovation, or the courage to question what everyone accepts without thinking, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment about what spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through patience, observation, and trust in knowledge older than themselves. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't given to you by the hardware store or the lumber mill. Sometimes it's the one you carve with your own two hands, guided by the wisdom of those who came before, built slowly from stone and time, designed to hold warmth like a promise kept through the longest nights of winter.